when I was wondering who would be the most amazing speakers to address the topic of electronics repair, I had already been talking in collaborations with Josh Lepowski for many months now. He has been someone who's worked with me both in my capacity at Intel, doing sustainability strategy, and also just more recently work that we've been doing on waste, which will be coming up later in the series. But Josh and Steve Jackson have really been, in my mind, and from where I've been sitting in the US setting, the true champions of repair scholarship for many years. So it's now my great pleasure to introduce them. I'm going to begin with formal introductions, and then I'm going to start asking them a few questions in the spirit of catalysing a conversation between these remarkable researchers. Beginning with Steve. Now, Steve, I'm so grateful that you managed to join us under the conditions of your busy schedule. Steve Jackson is Professor in the Department of Information Science and Department of Science and Technology Studies at Cornell University, with additional graduate field appointments in Communication and Public Affairs. He is past Chair of Information Science, Dean of William Keeton House, and since July 2023, which I'm sure is a blur for Steve, Vice-Provost for Academic Innovation at Cornell. In addition to this, he also directs the Computing on Earth Lab, dedicated to investigating the planetary dimensions and consequences of computing, from problems of sourcing and extraction to energy and water consumption to technology waste and repair. So I'm hoping we will hear a little bit more about that lab today. And Steve has been the author of many influential articles, both just in terms of his own scholarship and in collaboration with a number of his students over the years. His piece, Rethinking Repair, is one of the most, I think, influential articles in media and technology studies on the value and significance of studying this as the mainstream for what kind of scholarship we need right now. So I'm just delighted that he's here to share his thoughts. And alongside him, with a great visual, which I'm sure we will hear about, is Professor Josh Lepowski, Professor of Geography at Memorial University of Newfoundland. So he's even later at night than Steve is. Questions informing his research include: where and how are contemporary discards made? Where do they travel and where do their effects accumulate? Who gets what discards, where, how, and under what conditions? He's also interested in how maintenance and repair, broadly conceived, might offer both literal and figurative lessons for figuring out how to live well together in permanently polluted and always breaking worlds. And I can already see a reference to Steve in that paragraph too, so you can imagine the synergies we're going to hear. Josh is author of Reassembling Rubbish, Worlding Electronic Waste, field-defining book, which is what made me want to meet him in the first place. And most recently with Max Liboron, Discard Studies. This is another field-defining collection. Wasting Systems and Power. So it's just out with MIT Press, I think. So without further ado, I would like to hand the floor over to Steve and Josh with an opening question for this conversation. And it's a pretty obvious one, but what first attracted you to the topic of repair?
Josh, you want to go first?
Oh, so polite.
It is very polite. Sure, I'll jump in. And thank you, Mel, for that really wonderful introduction. My goodness. I think the way I would answer that question about getting first interested in repair, it was very concrete and very empirical. I was still in the very early days of my fieldwork on global trade and traffic of electronic waste. I had started to do some field work outside of North America, initially in Singapore and then in Bangladesh. This is roughly 2009. And I would say that it was to some extent in Singapore, but for sure in Bangladesh, where it became viscerally apparent that the view of what e-waste is and what it looks like and what it is connected to was so tightly bracketed to show a very particular view of the world, and left, quite literally left out this whole other connected ecology, if you will, of businesses of various sizes. So it was really witnessing that and the direct connections between, for lack of a better word, sort of like, you know, like classic images of people working with electronic waste, and then following some of the bits and pieces from those immediate sites to the next steps, where just in a straightforward empirical sense, I could not just be thinking about waste anymore. And it took me, I would say, quite a number of years before I got round to thinking about repair beyond those very concrete empirical questions, and started thinking about the more, I don't know, allegorical, I guess, aspects of repair. And a lot of that shift for me came from eventually reading Steve's work. So I don't know if that's a nice segue to you, Steve.
Yeah.
Well, if we talk about waste later, I'm going to say exactly the same thing, but in reverse, because waste is the thing that came to me after repair, and it was your work that really taught me how to think about it differently, really. So on the repair stuff, I guess my road into it is sort of a combination of empirical, like Josh, and then also sort of a theoretical priming that kind of made me attend to these things in particular ways when I encountered them in the world. So on the empirical side, the first field work that I was engaged in, and I should say that basically all of my field work is collaborative with students. That's true of like 99% of what I do, 95% of what I do. And the first field work we were involved in was with two wonderful students, Gabe Krishock and Alex Pompey, master's students at the time. And they had gone to Namibia to study other things, actually. They had gone to study sort of computing for development kinds of programs. There were some computer donation programs that was, I think, going to be the center of the work. And when they got there, as many of you will be familiar, it became very clear that the official description of the programs were completely off. The programs weren't actually really happening because everything was broken. What turned out was happening kind of on the sides of this in a much more interesting way was a very rich repair ecosystem, which was almost entirely excluded from the formal system. So the kind of irony of the situation is they had this official kind of government with a US partner kind of program that was stuck, completely broken down and not working because they couldn't find anyone to fix things. And then you had this rich local ecosystem, which was right there. It was like literally right next door, and they weren't connected, right? And the formalities of that system would not allow the recognition of that repair work. So that was sort of the first kind of empirical trigger for me, I guess, on this. It jumped out at me in part because of a long-standing interest in infrastructure studies and a particular sort of strain within infrastructure studies associated with people I had worked with, like Jeff Bowker and Lee Starr, which really emphasizes the centrality of breakdown as an essential moment of infrastructure. So the classic line from a definition of infrastructure that Lee offers is that infrastructure is invisible until broken. Things are invisible until they break down. And so that moment of breakdown, that sort of not yet repair, that wasn't yet so much in the discussion of infrastructure studies at that time, but that sort of attending to questions of breakdown and understanding that as a seminal and generative kind of moment, right? Like things are happening when things break, right? There's something really crucial in that moment. And we could talk more if people want. There's kind of a much longer line in American pragmatism that kind of, I would just say essentially that American pragmatism is a philosophy built around breakdown and repair, although it's maybe putting it a little too strong. But that's how I got into repair.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a good segue to the next question too, because I'm conscious that we have North Americans as our first speakers at this event, and one of the things that really justified why I was asking you to speak is how international your research is, in spite of your location. And I say North American, right, because these are wonderful Canadians, despite where they may end up. So tell us about some of these international projects, and I'm really also wanting to emphasize the collaborative nature of them. You're both wonderful leaders and partners and teachers in the way that you do your research. But it's really unique to be able to speak about the different cultures and the different countries that you've studied. So what do they tell you about American biases in how technology is described? And just can you tell us a little bit more about those findings?
Sure, I could pick up maybe a little bit because I'd mentioned the Namibia site. So this was really the first sort of the first place that our studies kind of picked up. And I talked a little bit already about that sort of very sharp dividing line between formal and informal, and the almost complete non-recognition, sort of the official accounts of technology, in this case, computing technologies, and also the official nature of government programs just made this part of the world invisible. Like it made it literally not possible to see that there was this rich thing right there. Which was quite stunning once you dug into it. So that was sort of, I'd say actually that's a finding that's held up across really, I'd say all the other sites we've looked at too as a general principle. So from that, I've been involved in studies that in other places like Bangladesh. My wonderful former PhD student Ishtiaq Ahmed led a wonderful set of studies there. He's now a computer science professor in Toronto. And then also some work in Cambodia, and actually we'll be returning to Uganda. So the work I've done, I worked with a wonderful postdoc, Lara Houston, who did her dissertation field work in Uganda. And we collaborated around some follow-ons to that. We will be doing an additional follow-up project, fieldwork launching in the spring with Daniel Musigwa, who's a new PhD student here at Cornell. In terms of things that sort of connect across these sites, I'm kind of interested in the connections as much as the differences, actually. This is maybe kind of a surprising finding to me in some ways. In each site, we saw these really rich systems of apprentice learning that looked really different from the way we teach computing at least in the US, and I can imagine that might be true in Australia as well. So the modes of learning and transmission of repair knowledge were really quite different. It was very tactile, it was very hands-on. In many of the places we've studied it, it sort of flowed through existing social, sometimes even familial networks as a mode of organization. I talked a little bit about the formal and informal dimensions. One of the sharp dividing lines that have shown up in all the countries that I've had a chance to look at is a really sharp divide between the kinds of activities that are going on in what are often informal repair markets and what's usually called the authorized repair section, which would be kind of like the local equivalent of the Apple iStore or whatever, Samsung's authorized repair center. And those two worlds really don't come together very well, except on the side, occasionally there are things that come into the authorized repair center when there's actually not very much repair going on. Those are mostly recycling operations at the end of the day. Occasionally, the stuff that comes in there will get retracked sort of at night to the local informal repair markets where the repair expertise actually primarily lives. And of course, the local repairers are very gleeful about this because it's like these you know, hot shit Samsung people are coming to get their phones fixed, you know, in the down low market. So those are some things that we've seen. There's also actually some interesting ties that unite across. So there's for people who do phone repair, there's a website actually that we saw show up in almost all of our studies called GSM Forum. And in all of the different places we've studied, local repairers are making use of global resources. So there is a form of networking that goes on there. The companies are not part of it. The companies are separate from this, but there are sort of transnational forms of organization that are really quite interesting, I think.
I mean, I think I might add a little bit there, if it's okay to, I think a lot of the focus of the work that I've been involved with, and like Steve, it would be impossible without the grad students that I've worked with over the years, but especially in Bangladesh, really through circumstance, getting connected to someone who would later become a student, Mostam Bila, who had already done a very sophisticated and in-depth study of shipbreaking in Bangladesh, the dismantling of, you know, the huge container ships, and the kind of economic relations that all of that was bundled up with. I mean, somewhat differently from Steve and his students' work, the focus, and maybe it's disciplinary, you know, as a geographer, I've been consistently interested in following the things, not because things are inherently more interesting than people in any way, but it is a journey, it's a travel, it's a and so in Bangladesh, sort of in contrast to some of the work that I've done in Peru, I think that you know, one of the things we saw was the connectivity of those waste and scrap businesses with local, meaning like next door repair, and then just a couple of doors away, materials recovery, whether it's scrap plastic or scrap metals of different sorts or components. Those kinds of things were much, at least when I was in Bangladesh, which admittedly was a while ago now, were much more clustered and adjacent to each other than they are in Peru. Peru, at least in Lima, that work in Lima was almost 10 years apart. So there's perhaps some evolution of the formal, informal markets there that make a difference. But in the case of Lima, things were much more spread out. There was clustering of repair businesses very close together, but then those ancillary connections were spread out over a much larger geographic area. So
yeah, I can see it's taking you down memory lane thinking about some of these projects and also the romance of fieldwork since COVID has affected a lot of these plans for more research. Josh, I just wanted to skip to a question that might get us to your amazing background image. So what does your research show about the ecological benefits of repair, either locally or if you'd like to scale up to the planetary?
Yeah. Big sigh. So the picture is pretty mixed, and I don't want anything that I'm going to say to come across as a criticism of any streams of work or anybody's work in particular, because my work falls very much in this kind of zone, but I never know how it's mirrored. Okay, so on one side of the screen, you have the annual waste arising from a single copper mine. That's an actual copper mine in Chile, Chuquicamata, Chile. It's the largest copper mine in the world. Electronics are the second largest consumers of mined copper. The other one, the first is construction and electrical, so almost electronics, but not quite. So that's waste from a single mine in a year. On on the other side is all of the post-consumer e-waste collected in the entire EU region in a year. And so the point is that a lot of my work, and I think a good deal of work in this field is focused. I have to, which finger do I use? Anyway, focused over here. And in some pretty blunt ways, it tells us, like, even if we magically repair all of that post-consumer e-waste, we will have done basically nothing here in mining or in manufacturing. So it's maybe too small to see, but if there was a 1% improvement, or if you will, a reduction of waste at that single mine in Chile, that would be the same as a 28% reduction in the post-consumer e-waste in the EU.
Right.
And it's taken me a number of years to sort of get to that point of realization, and it has kind of pulled me up short and made me think once again harder, more slowly and more carefully about what it is I think I'm doing when I'm talking about repair and why it matters. So
yeah, that's wonderful.
You know, I think that's such an important point, and I think that's often lost sight of. I think that when we're looking down at the moment of a right to repair law or something like that, I think this always has to be borne in mind. To me, it kind of strikes. To me, what it speaks to is the need for kind of a multi-scalar kind of imagination in how we approach these things. So, you know, we should be looking at how we can repair things, whether, you know, phone, a computer, or whatever. And I think there's values in that, including values beyond sustainability, which I'll come back to in a minute. But we also have to be thinking at the level of infrastructures and sort of whole planet systems. So I actually think that one of the next challenges and questions is whether repair thinking that's been framed, at least in part, at the level of you know, devices and sort of discrete systems, can be reconfigured to really have purchase on things that are operating at the level of infrastructure and, again, whole planet systems. The one thing I'll add, though, on the local sort of even at that site, the local repair of things, you know, when I've done work with amateur repair movements, in my case, the ones I've worked with are mostly in New York, but there are these all around the world, including Australia. It's interesting that there are people who are, so sustainability in kind of a standard environmental sense is certainly one of the values that brings people there and one of the things people are doing in that context. But there's really many others. And in some of the sites I've worked in, I wouldn't even say that's the top level reason people are repairing. People repair to work out a relationship to things, right? To build a relationship to a thing that is maybe going a little bit beyond pure consumption or pure consumer good. People are repairing together in these contexts to build forms of community that are maybe harder to find in the way our politics and economics have gone. So I totally think we need to think at higher scales. I totally think it's at the sort of sustainability metrics level, it's a small piece of a much larger puzzle. And I also want to think about the kind of multivalent values that are at play when we think about and practice repair.
Yeah, I think that is such an important point. And when I talk about the figure that's behind me there, I do always try to make the point that what I am saying is not also an argument to don't repair. But what you're saying there, I think, is so important, that there are a whole range of other goods, values, as it were, that are enacted through repair sites, through the practices of repair. Quite well, they may be connected, although perhaps tangentially to, to sustainability, but are certainly valuable. And those values around community building and whatnot, I think really do need to be remembered for sure. I think
Okay.
maybe, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I'm wondering, just in terms of the next conversation we're going to have today as well, whether the changes you've seen over the years with software's role in either accelerating consumption or impeding repair, whether we might just touch on that briefly. And as the audience also thinks about questions that you might like to ask our guests, I'm just going to observe from what I've read of your work, both of you, that when you first started as early scholars in this field studying repair, one of the key concerns was how software was being used to create artificial slowdown, the perception that people needed to upgrade because their devices seemed to be becoming obsolete. And today, linking to the theme of the ADM+S Centre, AI is becoming another catalyst, forcing upgrades and more powerful computing requirements on people who may or may not want them. And you've both mentioned in some of your recent writing that the data-centric business models of these hardware companies that are ultimately the ones designing these devices are likely to make whatever repair right we achieve, privatized, something that you need to pay for as a service under specific conditions. And that's something that I wanted to ask you about, just because obviously the locations where you've done research on repair may be very good proof points to show that designing for this high performance computing may be clearly implicated in stopping repair and reuse. Do you have any thoughts on that based on what you've seen?
Yeah, I think that's a fear, right? I think that I would say that over time you've seen a world where you could really think about the phone as a little bit more of a standalone physical object into one that's always and forever tethered, to use Jonathan Zittrain's term, I guess, to the company, right? So you own things a little bit less every year, is one way to put it, right? In the sense, and we see the mechanisms for this, right? We see remote updates, remote kills of devices. That's been a thing. We've seen decisions to artificially slow down. Lots of reasons are given for that, but one reason certainly seems to be kind of a different version of a planned obsolescence or an accelerated obsolescence model. So I don't exactly know where AI fits into this story yet. I haven't been able to connect those dots exactly to see what the next, if that contributes a next version to this. I've been doing some work lately actually to think again kind of from the other direction and try and tell a repair-centric account of AI itself, right? So one of the problems of AI, one of many problems of AI, is that we tell stories about it that sort of exaggerates its efficacy or exaggerates its freestandingness. But if you do some work to kind of dig into models and how they're actually put together and how they're deployed, particularly in applied contexts, what you see is a whole lot of people very often working behind the scenes to fix the things that the model is routinely breaking on, right? And my concern with the story, this is just another version in some ways of my standard story, I guess, is that my concern is the stories we tell about technology and the stories we tell about AI routinely exclude that work, and in the process invisibilize that category of labor and make technology and AI seem more sort of relentless and inexorable and unchangeable and more freestanding than it in fact is. So it gives AI and technology too much autonomy, whereas the real world, you really look at it, it has much less autonomy than our stories granted.
I was going to maybe just offer a more I don't know, I guess empirical take on things there, and probably just emphasizing things that Steve already said, but I've tried to make a distinction between right to repair and right to repairability. And and while that, I suppose, is a conceptual distinction, it to some extent is concrete or practical as well, in that, we see over and over again companies in a variety of sectors, right? Perhaps most visibly now in the auto sector, that are finding ways to insert software such that, the car that used to be, as it were, in a way, a unit, is increasingly disaggregated into bits and pieces that can be subsequently not sold to you, but rented to you, right? You want your heated seats to come on, well, that's a subscription. You want your audio, that's a subscription, and so on and so forth. And that is all facilitated by putting software between you and the bits and pieces of the machine.
Yeah.
And shout out, I see MC on the screen, and I think MC is speaking later, so you'll probably get to hear more about cars and repair coming up, I believe.
We can't avoid cars. It's true. Okay, so I think this is going to be my last question so that we have room for others. And we've touched on this a little bit, but given the framing of today's event, what do you both think are the limits of repair as the primary focal point for sustainable computing research and activism? And I think, Josh, because you touched on this to start with, maybe Steve, you'd like to lead us on this one.
Well, I think Josh's weather map graphic there behind is actually giving a pretty good gives up one pretty good answer to this story, right? Like we could make our devices much more fixable, and if we didn't change anything else, that would have a positive impact on sustainability, have other positive impacts as well, as I've articulated, but it wouldn't in itself sort of change the overall trajectory of how computing and technology works. So, Mel, you mentioned a lot of my thinking is now framed in a bit more of is sort of putting repair in sort of a more comprehensive framework. I'm using this computing on Earth language, but putting all of the material processes together. So understanding how sourcing and extraction is itself a site of key interest, how that relates to energy and water consumption, how that itself is implicated in problems of waste and repair. What I hope we can do over time is sort of pull back from discrete individual concerns in each of these areas to tell sort of a more global and comprehensive story about sustainability is a complicated language. We could talk about what's good and what's bad about that framing, but our whole set of material relations to the world as aided and enacted through computing. If we can do that better, we can look more widely, including beyond repair, to put repair in this wider frame. I think that's where we really need to go.
If I have a minute or two, I can try to add to that. Yeah. So I think I think I might talk about the potential limits of repair in a couple of ways, and sort of ways that, I don't know, I suppose we could overcome those limits, as it were. One would be to work harder at remembering to not mistake consumer repair and device repair for repair. It is, it's one segment. I think our notions of why repair matters, what it does, what it means, would be substantially changed if our starting point for research, as it were, or thinking about repair was, for lack of a better term, industrial. What is it to do repair to the machines in a semiconductor manufacturing facilities. Those are giant multi-million dollar machines, so on and so forth. Or, you know, what does it mean when repair is what the you know, the military does to keep its machines going? That has a very different valence and a very different magnitude, and may include, you know, in a certain weird way, environmental benefits, but probably not the way many of us would choose to talk about those initially, right? Mm-hmm. I think maybe the last point I'll make is that rather than being a limit of repair, perhaps it's a limitation of how we think about repair. If the meaning of repair is, I think, expanded to think about, you know, repair, redress of those peoples and places that are harmed through extraction, through manufacturing, etc., then repair becomes much more expansive and networked, as it were, back to the politicization of extraction, of manufacturing, and as entry points, as it were, for both research and activism.
Well, thank you for doing the advance promotion for our next topics in this series, Josh, because that's exactly why we're trying to do multiple events, because there's not a clear cutoff point between the different entry avenues into this sustainable computing topic. We would like to take some questions from the floor, either the virtual floor or the real life floor here in Brisbane. Does anybody have a question? Because I have a mic for you if you do. And if you'd like a question online, you can use the chat or the Q&A. So shy. Here we go. You must speak into the mic.
Thanks. I mean, unfortunately, this is slightly less of a question as a kind of follow-up on what you were talking about, and on the graphic, of course, that you kind of sharing with us. I think one of the thoughts I had is in terms of the way many of the discourses around right to repair are being framed, which is often in terms of a cost saving to a consumer usually with disposable income, not necessarily cost savings to people at the very end of the chain that we've talked about in Bangladesh and elsewhere. That what is the value then of cost saving if the money saved is essentially just going to go into other forms of consumption? Mm-hmm. And how do you then connect those two things? And then perhaps extending on from what Josh was saying, perhaps the real measure is not in the volume of e-waste that's processed, but in, you know, a market reduction in the markets for the commodities that we're seeing on the left-hand side. So, you know, perhaps we measure the right to repair versus drop-off in demand for copper, or not just cheaper copper for other uses. So I suppose that's the macro and micro version of the same problem. Is there a hydraulics that will come into play, which negates the gain at one side at the other?
I mean, I can speak to that a little bit, not with any good solid numbers, but by drawing attention to, and many in the audience or online may already know this, but this idea of the rebound effect or the Jevons paradox that ecological economists draw attention to, that the basic idea is, you know, so William Stanley Jevons, 19th century economist, studies the coal industry as industrialization is taking off, and he finds this seemingly counterintuitive finding that as the efficiency of machines increases, so machines are getting more efficient at using coal, so they need less of it, more and more coal gets used because it now is cheaper to run the machines, so you can run them longer, faster, and so on and so forth. And there are lots of very quantitative empirical studies from different parts of the world and different segments of different economies that kind of show again and again that where efficiency gains are made, they're over some period of time generally wiped out by the aggregate increase in demand for this or that material or this or that commodity or whatnot. Now, is that inevitable? I think that is an open question. I think it's also, I think it's an open question.
Maybe just to add on one reference or shout out actually, that's a very different framing of maybe a similar set of questions. There's a group of scholars who seem to be centered in Europe, at least this is who I've encountered recently, who've been working with this concept that they call permacomputing. And permacomputing is kind of, as you might imagine, it's kind of an attempt to reimagine computing according to permaculture principles, which is a fundamentally weird exercise, right? Because computing is so not that, right? And yet it raises all these questions that I think speak to your question just now. And I also give it as a shout out because permaculture, I believe, is a Tasmanian invention, at least in part. Is that not right, Mel?
I'm sure there are many people that want to claim it, but I will certainly take that one. Yeah. Thanks. Okay, any other questions in the room or online? Come on. Anyone? They're all looking very shy here in Brisbane. If anyone's still awake online, we would love to have you. Okay, we do have one taker. Thanks.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, you mentioned this, right, that the repairability of an object has a lot more benefits besides just sustainability, right? And it alters your relationship to that object. Yeah, I was just wondering if you could talk more about it. What are those additional benefits and how, right? It seems like that kind of state of mind or that relationship is really something we need to cultivate in a sort of a climate-wracked world. And how might sort of repair and repair cultures support that?
Yeah, it's a great and wide question. There's a lot to be said, I think, there. There's been interesting work that's sort of in this field of aesthetics lately that has really sort of dived into the aesthetics of imperfection and sort of seeing this as an underdeveloped, basically. I mean, it goes back, it's ancient, it goes back a long ways, but in tech cultures, this idea of the smooth, shiny, sleek, sort of unmarred kind of thing is only one possible aesthetic. Have been scholars in the Netherlands who've done really interesting work around this. So I think there's an aesthetic possibility here that's not been fully realized. In terms of the immediate empirics that I was speaking about, I'm thinking of contexts in which I've watched and worked with communities, community organizations, little right to or repair organizations, the Brooklyn Fixers Collective, for example, where people are coming for lots of different reasons, right? And one of them is straight up economic, right? Like it's not like the object that they're bringing in to get fixed or to fix with others has any deep heirloom value. It's not like their grandparents' clock or something. It's some lamp they got for $20 at Walmart here. But $20 is $20, right? And so there's actually a fairly surprising to me, there was really a wide sort of cross-class socioeconomic convergence around some of these sites. And I think that in itself, at least in the US today, is a rarer and rarer occurrence and is valuable in its own right. The other thing I saw a lot of is local repair centers, serving as a point of community gathering in a way, in the same way that people used to go do other things to be with other people in random but structured ways. Many of those opportunities have, I think, become more attenuated, at least in the US, and others could speak to other countries. And so I was really struck by how many people were there because it was a way to be with people, right? It was a way to do things together. It was focused on an object. It was focused on an activity. Sometimes there were actually a statistically improbable number of retired AT&T engineers, the old telephone company engineers who were doing this work. And they had these skills, right? They had this skill set. They were retired. What were they going to do? Like watch Wheel of Fortune? No, they had these skills. They wanted to do them with people. And so this was one of the things that brought them out. So that's just like a quick snapshot. And I think if you looked at some of the repair cafes around Brisbane or Melbourne or anywhere really, you'd see some of that range. And so that, I think, too, should be not lost sight of, kind of that micro social value of repair, even, you know, beyond what we're talking about on the economics, beyond what we're talking about on sustainability.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you so much to our brave question askers and to our late night speakers. It's been such a joy to introduce Josh and Steve to this audience today, and I'm really excited that this idea of computing with others is the note on which we end this first discussion. I think there will be more to come on that topic in other events we're holding. But please thank Josh and Steve for making time to join us today, and let them go to bed or whatever they might like to do.